the moment my manager said, "This department would move faster if someone more flexible were leading it." The boardroom went silent. Not the polite kind of silence, the kind that presses against your ears and tells you something has already been decided. I was sitting halfway down the table, laptop closed, notes untouched. I had learned long ago that when men like Adrian Holt spoke in carefully vague phrases, they weren't offering feedback. They were setting a trap. Adrian didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the board. "Flexibility matters now," he continued, hands folded. "Marin's approach has always been thorough, but the market is shifting. Thorough. That word again. The corporate synonym for slow, cautious, replaceable, across from me." A few directors nodded. One of them scribbled something in the margin of a printed agenda. No one asked which numbers I had stabilized, which contracts I had salvaged, or why our operational failures had mysteriously stopped once I took over systems oversight 3 years earlier. Adrian smiled not at me, but at the outcome he expected. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I didn't remind them that the logistics platform they praised last quarter existed because I rebuilt it after his last flexible experiment nearly triggered a compliance breach. Instead, I listened when the chair cleared his throat and said, "We'll take this under advisement." I felt something settle inside me, calm, clean, certain, because I already knew how this would end. The resignation letter sat in my bag, printed the night before. Not out of panic, out of clarity. Adrian hadn't just criticized my work. He had spent weeks reframing it, slowly convincing the board that stability was stagnation and that experience was resistance. He thought he was pushing me out. What he didn't realize was that I had already stepped sideways as the meeting adjourned. Adrian finally looked at me. His eyes carried the quiet confidence of a man who believes he has won. I smiled back. Not because I was defeated, but because I knew what happens when people confuse silence for surrender, and when they remove the one person who understands how everything actually holds together. How are you feeling right now? If you've been listening for a while, try closing your eyes for about 20 seconds and noticing your thoughts slow down just a little. A tiny pause that can help you reset right where you are. Where are you listening from today? If these quiet, heavy moments resonate with you, consider subscribing and stay with me, because what comes next is where everything begins to shift in a way no one in that room expected. They like to say I was cautious, that I moved carefully, that I double-checked things other people were comfortable rushing through. Over the years, that word careful had quietly been reshaped into something else inside meeting rooms. Conservative, old-fashioned, inflexible. But none of those people were there the first time the system almost failed, 3 years earlier, when Halcyon Freight Solutions signed its largest regional contract. The numbers looked perfect on paper. What no one wanted to see were the hidden dependencies, the brittle vendor timelines, the compliance clauses that punished speed without documentation, the fragile handoffs between legacy software and newer automation layers. That was the week I stopped going home before midnight. I rewrote workflows line by line, not to make them faster, but to make them survivable. When one supplier missed a delivery window, the system didn't collapse. When a client audit landed unannounced, the data matched. When an outage threatened to cascade across 3 regions, it stopped with us. Adrian called it over-engineering. The board called it reliability. What they didn't realize was that reliability isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself in dashboards or flashy presentations. It's invisible when it works, and unforgettable when it's gone. Adrian never sat beside me during those long weeks. He would stop by my desk occasionally, glance at my screen, and ask whether I'd considered streamlining. When I explained why a step couldn't be removed without violating a clause, he nodded politely and walked away. Later, I would see that same step missing from a revised deck he sent upstairs. At first, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. Then it happened again. And again. Reports I authored came back with sections rewritten, conclusions softened, risks reframed as temporary inefficiencies. My name still appeared in the footer, but the substance was quietly altered when I pointed it out. Adrian smiled and said, I just helped make it more digestible. Digestible for whom was never discussed. Around that time, meetings started happening without me. Decisions I should have been consulted on arrived as announcements instead. When I asked why, Adrian would say, We didn't want to slow you down. The irony wasn't lost on me. What unsettled me most wasn't the sidelining, it was the pattern. The board was hearing a version of our operations that felt smoother than reality, cleaner, less resistant, less me. And the more Adrian spoke about future readiness, the more he framed my work as something the company had already outgrown. That was when I started keeping my own records. Not out of spite, out of instinct. Emails, version histories, approval chains, quiet changes that only someone close enough would notice. I didn't yet know what I would need them for. I only knew that when stability is recast as weakness, something is about to be pushed too far, and people like Adrian rarely stop until they do. The first discrepancy was small enough to ignore. A shipping variance that didn't match the system log. A delivery window that appeared to shorten without explanation. On their own, each inconsistency could be dismissed as noise, the kind that creeps into any growing operation. Together, they formed a rhythm I didn't recognize. I noticed it during a routine review, the kind I had done dozens of times before. The dashboard Adrian presented showed improved throughput, reduced delays, and smoother handoffs between vendors. The numbers looked impressive, too impressive. I pulled the raw data afterward, expecting to confirm the gains. Instead, I found gaps, timestamps that didn't line up with process dependencies, completion markers that skipped mandatory checkpoints, risk buffers quietly removed and replaced with optimistic assumptions. It wasn't chaos, it was curation. Someone had decided which truths were useful. I flagged the first issue privately. Adrian replied within minutes, cheerful and reassuring. We're testing a more agile framework. Early results can look messy. Messy wasn't the word. A week later, the same pattern appeared in a different region, different team, same omissions. When I cross-referenced the changelogs, the approvals traced back to Adrian's credentials. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I started running parallel validations, my own quiet confirmations, against the contractual baselines I had negotiated years earlier. That was when the risk became unmistakable. One of our largest clients operated under federal oversight. Any material change to process required disclosure, documentation, and approval. The steps Adrian had removed weren't cosmetic. They were protective. Without them, we were exposed. I documented everything: screenshots, version comparisons, email headers. I kept copies outside the internal system, not because I distrusted it, but because I recognized how easily truth could be reframed once it entered a room full of confident voices. At the next leadership meeting, Adrian presented the updated metrics with visible pride. We've cut cycle time by nearly 20%, he said. This is what happens when we stop clinging to outdated constraints. Several board members nodded. I spoke calmly. Those constraints are tied to client compliance. We can't remove them without disclosure. Adrian smiled. We're not removing them. We're optimizing. The room accepted that answer more readily than I expected. That was the moment I understood the danger. Not just of flawed data, but of belief. Once people believe a story of progress, they stop asking what it costs. After the meeting, I sat alone in my office longer than usual. The building hummed with late-day movement. Unaware of how close we were to stepping off a line we couldn't easily step back from. Adrian wasn't reckless. He was confident. And confidence, when it overrides structure, has a way of collapsing systems from the inside quietly at first. And then all at once, the meeting invite arrived without context. No agenda, no pre-read. Just a calendar block titled Operational Alignment Review and a list of names that told me everything I needed to know. 2 board members who rarely attended mid-quarter sessions. Legal, Finance. Adrian. I didn't rush to prepare slides. I didn't rehearse defenses. I reviewed timelines instead. The night before the meeting, I laid everything out across my dining table: printed contracts, annotated workflows, my own internal notes, tracing when safeguards had been removed and by whom. I wasn't planning to present them. I just needed to see the full shape of what had been happening. It wasn't sloppy. It wasn't accidental. It was a narrative being assembled carefully, piece by piece. By the time I closed my laptop, the resignation letter was already written. Not because I planned to lose, but because I refused to be trapped into justifying reality to people who had already decided it was inconvenient. The boardroom felt different the next morning. Chairs were arranged more tightly. No small talk. Adrian sat closer to the head of the table than usual. Posture relaxed. Expression attentive in a way that read as rehearsed concern. I took my seat and waited. The chair opened with a summary of operational concerns. Vague phrases floated across the table: pace misalignment, strategic friction, resistance to modernization. None of them named a single metric. None of them referenced a single contract. Then Adrian spoke. He framed it gently, praised my past contributions, acknowledged my stability during earlier phases, and then, with professional sympathy, suggested that the company had outgrown my leadership style. I listened without interrupting. When the chair finally asked if I had anything to add, the room leaned forward just slightly. They expected a defense, a negotiation, a promise to adapt. I didn't give them any of that. I understand the direction you want to move in, I said calmly, and I won't stand in the way of it. I reached into my bag and placed the resignation letter on the table. The silence that followed was sharper than before. Adrian blinked. Just once. I believe this is the cleanest outcome for everyone, I continued. Effective immediately. The chair hesitated, then nodded. Acceptance came faster than surprise. As if the decision had already been rehearsed, this simply resolved the remaining inconvenience. As the meeting adjourned, no one stopped me. No one asked questions. Adrian finally met my eyes near the door. His smile was polite, controlled, satisfied. He thought I had conceded. What he didn't realize was that by stepping away, I had removed the last barrier between his story and the systems that could no longer support it. And stories, no matter how convincing, collapse when they are asked to carry weight they were never built for. If you think you understand, the next paragraph will change your mind. My first week away from Halcyon Freight Solutions felt unnervingly quiet. No urgent messages, no late-night alerts, no dashboards blinking red for attention, for the first time in years. My phone stayed still on the kitchen counter, while the morning light crept across the floor. At first, I wondered if that was the point, if Adrian had already smoothed everything over, if the systems I'd built were sturdy enough to hold without me, if I had misjudged how replaceable I truly was. Then the call started. Not to me, but around me. A former analyst messaged to ask where a specific contingency file was stored. A vendor contact I trusted reached out, confused about a revised process request that contradicted our standing agreement. A compliance liaison sent a neutral inquiry about a timeline discrepancy that needed clarification. None of them sounded panicked. Yet, what they all had in common was hesitation. They were following instructions that didn't quite make sense, but they didn't know who to question anymore. Adrian had stepped into the gap confidently. That much was clear. He chaired meetings, reassured partners, and spoke fluently about optimization. On the surface, things moved faster, steps were skipped, approvals streamlined, decisions made without delay, speed. Finally, but speed has a cost when it outruns understanding. I watched from a distance, not because I was hiding, but because distance reveals patterns proximity obscures. Without me there to quietly correct course, the system began responding exactly as it was designed to, rejecting assumptions it couldn't validate. A delayed shipment here, a mismatched invoice there, small things, explainable things, until they weren't. By the end of the second week, a vendor paused fulfillment pending clarification on liability exposure. By the 3rd, a client requested a formal review of recent process changes. The tone remained professional, but the questions grew sharper. Adrian's name appeared more often in copied emails, and his responses grew longer. I didn't intervene. I didn't offer guidance. Not out of spite, but because I had learned something important over the years. Systems don't punish ambition. They punish shortcuts. One afternoon, an unfamiliar number flashed on my screen. I let it ring out. The voicemail arrived moments later. "Marin, this is Adrian. I just wanted to check in. There are a few contextual questions the team is struggling to answer." He sounded composed, but beneath it, there was strain. Questions. When ignored long enough. Stop being optional. I deleted the message without responding. That night, I sat at my desk and opened a notebook I hadn't touched since resigning. Inside were the same records I'd kept quietly for months, not as weapons, but as memory. I realized then that my resignation hadn't created the instability. It had simply removed the illusion that stability came from confidence rather than structure. And once that illusion cracks, no amount of reassurance can seal it again. By the time the board noticed something was wrong, the damage was no longer theoretical. It began with language. Emails stopped using words like optimization and efficiency and started leaning on clarification and temporary pause. Meetings multiplied. Legal was suddenly present in rooms it rarely entered unless something had already gone sideways. Adrian still spoke with confidence. He always did. But confidence, when repeated too often, begins to sound like explanation. A regional client requested written confirmation that recent workflow changes complied with the original agreement. Adrian assured them it did. Legal asked for documentation. There was a delay. A supplier flagged a revised delivery instruction as contradictory to liability terms. Adrian blamed a communication error. Finance asked who authorized the change. Each question arrived politely. Each answer took longer. What none of them could see yet was that Adrian was now responding to the system instead of directing it. He was chasing outcomes instead of understanding causes, and systems don't respond well to being chased. I heard about the emergency session from a former colleague who still trusted me enough to speak carefully. The board had requested a full operational reconciliation current workflows against original contractual baselines. That was never a good sign. Those baselines were mine. Adrian could present revised metrics, smoother graphs, optimistic projections. But reconciliation doesn't care about presentation. It asks only one question: does this match what was agreed to? The answer, inevitably, was no. A week later, another voicemail appeared on my phone. "Marin, it's Adrian again. Look, I know things didn't end smoothly, but your institutional knowledge could really help right now. Even just a quick conversation. This time, the strain wasn't hidden. I didn't return the call. Not because I wanted him to struggle, but because this was the exact moment he needed to understand the difference between knowledge and authority. Between speaking confidently and knowing where the load-bearing points actually are. You can't outsource accountability after the fact, from what I later learned. The board's patience thinned quickly. Questions shifted from what happened to who approved this. Timelines were scrutinized. Access logs reviewed. Adrian's name appeared repeatedly, not as an innovator, as a bottleneck. The irony was quiet and sharp. He had framed my work as resistance to progress. Now, without that resistance, progress had accelerated straight into exposure. The board didn't call it a failure. They called it a governance issue. And governance issues don't resolve themselves with enthusiasm or charisma. They resolve through documentation, responsibility, and consequences. By the time Adrian realized that, the story he had told about me, about caution, about slowness, about obstruction, was being retold in reverse. And this time, I wasn't the one standing in the room trying to explain it. There was something in the back that no one expected. The audit didn't arrive with drama, no announcements, no all-hands email. Just a request formal, precise, unavoidable for documentation that already existed somewhere Adrian could no longer edit. Oversight has a tone of its own, calm, methodical, indifferent to narratives. The board framed it as routine governance, a reconciliation, they said, a precaution. But precautions only appear after confidence has been spent. The first thing the auditors asked for were the original operational baselines tied to our largest contracts, not the revised versions, not the summaries, the originals. I recognized them instantly when a former colleague described the list over a cautious phone call. The version numbers, the dependency maps, the clauses that required explicit disclosure before any material change. They were mine. Adrian tried to stay ahead of it. He sent clarifying memos. He offered contextual explanations. He volunteered to walk the auditors through the logic of the optimization strategy. They listened. Then they asked for approvals. That was where the tone shifted. Approvals aren't interpretive. They either exist or they don't. And when access logs were pulled, a pattern emerged that no presentation could soften. Changes initiated under Adrian's credentials. Reviews bypassed. Sign-offs implied but never granted. He wasn't accused. He was documented. The board's posture changed accordingly. Meetings that once felt directional became investigative. Legal stopped asking if and started asking when. Finance stopped forecasting and started freezing discretionary movement. Adrian, once central to every decision, was suddenly asked to wait outside rooms he used to lead. I learned all of this indirectly, through careful conversations, through pauses where people chose their words as if the walls might be listening, through the unmistakable shift in how my name was spoken, not as an obstacle, as a reference point. One board member reportedly asked a simple question that cut through weeks of deflection: if Myron Cole designed the original structure, why was she removed before these changes were implemented? No one answered immediately, because the answer was no longer flattering to anyone by the end of the week. Adrian's authority was limited to day-to-day continuity, no strategic changes, no new initiatives, no unsupervised revisions. He still had a title, but no leverage. Titles are fragile like that. I sat at home one evening, reviewing notes I hadn't needed to touch in weeks, and felt something unexpected settle in. Not satisfaction, not vindication, relief. The system was finally being allowed to speak for itself, without mediation, without ambition layered over reality. And when systems speak clearly, they rarely tell the story the loudest person in the room wanted to hear. The meeting where everything turned wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no accusations hurled across the table. Just a long, measured silence that settled over the room once the last document was placed in front of the board. Adrian sat at the far end this time, not by choice. The auditors had finished their review. Their findings were summarized in neutral language, no adjectives, no speculation, just dates, approvals, omissions, a timeline that told its story without needing a narrator. When the chair asked Adrian to respond, he did what he always had. He explained. He contextualized. He reframed decisions as adaptations. He spoke about pressure, speed, and the necessity of leadership judgment in evolving markets. He never raised his voice, never blamed anyone directly. But something had changed. No one interrupted him, but no one leaned in either. When he finished, the room remained quiet. Then a board member asked a question that hadn't been asked before. Were these changes disclosed to our clients in accordance with contractual requirements? Adrian hesitated. Just long enough. Another director followed. And were these risk buffers removed with legal sign-off? He glanced toward counsel. They didn't look back. The silence stretched. It wasn't hostile. It was procedural. The kind of silence that appears when process replaces persuasion. Finally, the chair spoke. "This isn't a matter of intent," she said calmly. "It's a matter of authorization." That word landed heavily. Authorization implies responsibility. And responsibility, once isolated, has a way of settling exactly where it belongs. By the end of the session, Adrian was asked to step away from operational oversight pending further review. The phrasing was careful, temporary, neutral, but no one in that room mistook it for anything else. Later that evening, I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in months. One of the board members, brief, professional. "We underestimated the implications of your departure." I read it once. Then again. It wasn't an apology. It was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, when it arrives this late, carries a particular weight. Adrian didn't contact me again after that. From what I learned, his days became filled with documentation requests, compliance interviews, and explanations delivered to people who no longer needed reassurance. Authority had moved away from him quietly, like water receding before a tide turns. The company issued no announcement, no press release. Internally, things simply slowed. Checks were reinstated, safeguards restored, decisions deferred. Stability, it turned out, required rebuilding. I sat at my desk that night, window open, city noise drifting in, and realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think until then. I hadn't walked away from power. I had stepped out of its distortion, and in doing so, I'd allowed the system to recalibrate around truth rather than confidence. That recalibration was still unfolding, and it wasn't finished yet. The outcome wasn't announced with headlines or urgency. It arrived in stages: careful, procedural, irreversible. First came the internal memo, then the revised governance policy, then the quiet reassignment of authority that made it clear Adrian Holt no longer shaped the company's direction. His title remained for a short while, stripped of scope and influence, until even that became impractical. When people asked where he was, the answers grew vague: on leave, transitioning, unavailable, words designed to soften what had already happened. The board began rebuilding the very structures they had allowed to be dismantled. Risk buffers were restored, approval chains reinstated, external partners were notified formally, transparently, of changes that should never have been obscured in the first place, and in those conversations. My name resurfaced, not as a comparison, not as a defense, as a reference. Return the process to the Cole framework. Verify against Marin's original dependencies. Does this align with the safeguards Marin put in place? I learned this slowly, through careful messages and quiet confirmations. No one asked me to return. No one offered to reverse the decision. They didn't need to. The company was no longer looking for leadership. It was looking for truth. Adrian's final review concluded without ceremony. The findings cited governance failures and unauthorized process changes. Responsibility was assigned without theatrics. His departure was framed as a mutual decision. Mutual is a word organizations use when they want an ending without reflection. What struck me most wasn't the fall itself, but how quickly the narrative corrected. The same people who once described my work as resistant now spoke of it as foundational. The same caution they dismissed was reframed as foresight, not out of remorse, out of necessity. One evening, a former director reached out privately, not to apologize but to say something closer to regret. "We didn't realize how much of the system depended on judgment." She wrote, "We mistook confidence for competence." I didn't respond. Not because I disagreed, but because some realizations don't require witnesses. The company stabilized, slowly, carefully, exactly the way it always had when process was allowed to do its work. Adrian became a footnote in quarterly updates, a lesson folded quietly into governance training. And me, I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was free of the need to be understood by people who only listen when consequence forces them to. As the final revisions settled into place, I realized something essential about how these stories end. Not with revenge, not with vindication, but with alignment when reality reasserts itself. And those who tried to bend it discover that systems remember who built them, even when people pretend not to. I didn't go back, not to the building, not to the role they quietly redefined in my absence. When the board finished repairing what had been bent out of shape, They didn't ask me to return to restore balance. They no longer needed to, by then. The system was standing on its own again, slower. Yes, but honest, predictable, grounded in reality rather than confidence, exactly as it had been designed to be. I watched from a distance as Halcyon Freight Solutions stabilized, not with curiosity, but with a calm sense of closure, the kind that comes when you realize you no longer need an ending that includes you. Adrian Holt became a cautionary example in conversations I wasn't part of. His name surfaced briefly, then less often, then not at all. Organizations are efficient that way. They absorb lessons quietly and move on. So do people. What stayed with me wasn't the vindication or the late acknowledgments. It was the clarity that followed. The understanding that doing things correctly often looks unimpressive until the moment shortcuts demand payment. I didn't laugh when I was fired. I laughed because I knew I wouldn't have to prove anything anymore. Since then, I've chosen my work carefully, not based on titles or urgency, but on alignment, on whether people value structure over spectacle, and integrity over speed. I no longer mistake silence for weakness, or patience for hesitation. Systems don't reward ego. They reward care and karma. I've learned, doesn't arrive with drama. It doesn't announce itself or ask for witnesses. It simply allows truth to resume its weight, until whatever was built on distortion can no longer stand. When that happens, you don't need to push. You just need to step aside and let gravity do the rest. I didn't understand the lesson while it was happening. I understood it later when the noise stopped, when no one was watching, and I could finally hear my own thoughts again. What stayed with me wasn't the meeting or the resignation, but the quiet truth that doing the right thing often feels invisible at first. Real value doesn't rush to defend itself. It waits, and when it finally speaks, it does so without anger, without drama, just clarity. That's the part that changed me. I stopped chasing approval and started trusting the work I put into the world. Even when it felt like I was standing alone. If you're still here with me, tell me, will you stay until the very end of this story, when this episode finishes? Take a moment for your health while seated. Gently roll your ankles in slow circles for about 20 seconds. It's a small movement, but it helps your body reset after sitting still. Where are you listening from right now? I truly want to know. If this story made you feel seen, leave a comment and share your thoughts. A like helps others discover stories like this. And subscribing means we'll keep having these quiet, honest moments together. Your presence matters more than you think, and the story doesn't really end here. 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 Doesn't really